The massive chamber stretched for miles in every direction, filled with thousands of alien beings from across the galaxy. Ambassador Lisa Martinez stood at the center of it all, her small human form dwarfed by the towering representatives surrounding her. The air hummed with translation devices converting hundreds of different languages into something she could understand. The smell was strange too, a mix of methane, sulfur, and things she had no name for. Above her, Chairman Vexthul loomed like a living nightmare. His insect-like body was covered in dark chitin, and his 6 eyes watched her with what might have been amusement. Forearms gestured as he spoke, his voice booming through the chamber like thunder. Lisa had dealt with many alien species during her 10 years as Earth's representative, but the chairman still made her skin crawl. The Zarathi delegation sat in their honored section, their gray skin gleaming under the chamber's artificial lights. They looked almost human from a distance, but Lisa knew better. She had seen the reports from the outer colonies, had read the testimonies of survivors from worlds the Zarathi had conquered. They were efficient killers, nothing more. War Commander Zethkul stepped forward, his movements precise and mechanical. When he spoke, his voice carried no emotion, just cold calculation. He began by listing humanity's crimes against galactic order. They had expanded too quickly, he said. They had taken resources that belonged to stronger species. They had built weapons that violated ancient treaties they had never signed. Lisa listened without changing her expression. She had heard these accusations before, though never delivered with such arrogance. The Zarathi spoke as if humanity should be grateful for their attention, as if being conquered by them was some kind of honor. The war commander's list went on for an hour. Humanity had colonized 47 worlds in just 2 centuries. They had built a military fleet that concerned their neighbors. They had refused to join the galactic tributary system that kept peace among the stars. Most importantly, they had ignored repeated warnings to limit their expansion. When he finished, Zethkul presented the Zarathi Empire's generous offer. Humanity could keep Earth and 3 of their oldest colonies. The Zarathi would take control of the outer systems, the ones rich in rare minerals and energy sources. Human military forces would be reduced to system defense only. Earth would pay tribute to the Empire, a modest sum that would barely strain their economy. The chamber buzzed with approval. Lisa watched as alien heads nodded and tentacles waved in agreement. The crystalline Z-lights calculated the offer's fairness in real time, their mathematical minds finding it more than reasonable. The peaceful Altarians, humanity's closest allies, whispered among themselves about how lucky humans were to receive such terms. Representative Korthani of the Hive Collective spoke next, his voice like grinding stone. His species had faced the Zarathi 3 centuries ago and accepted similar terms without complaint. Now they prospered under Zarathi protection, he claimed. Their worlds were safe from pirates and raiders. Their people lived in peace. Submission to superior force was simply the natural order of things. The Meditative Collective's representative, a floating jellyfish-like creature, agreed with flowing movements. Violence was primitive, she said. Enlightened species resolved conflicts through negotiation and compromise. The Zarathi offer represented the pinnacle of civilized diplomacy. Even the proud Centauri Federation, with their horse-like bodies and warrior traditions, supported the proposal. Their speaker, General Hailthor, spoke of honor and wisdom. Sometimes, he said, the greatest courage was knowing when to yield. The Zarathi were proven warriors. Fighting them would only bring unnecessary suffering. Lisa counted the votes as they came in. 47 species supported the Zarathi offer. 12 abstained, mostly smaller civilizations that feared taking sides. Only the Altarians spoke against it, and even they suggested humanity should consider accepting. The debate continued for hours. Speaker after speaker rose to praise the Zarathi Empire's restraint. They spoke of other species that had chosen unwisely, that had fought against impossible odds and paid terrible prices. The galaxy had learned from those mistakes. War was wasteful, negotiation was civilized, survival was more important than pride. Chairman Vexthul finally called for silence, his forearms raised high. The chamber fell quiet except for the hum of translation devices and the soft breathing of 1,000 different species. All eyes turned to Lisa, waiting for humanity's response. She could feel their expectation, their certainty that she would accept the inevitable. The chairman's voice echoed through the vast space. The Galactic Council had heard all arguments, he said. The Zarathi offer was fair and generous. The choice now belonged to humanity. They could accept peace and prosperity, or they could choose a path that led only to destruction. Lisa stood slowly, her legs shaking slightly from standing so long. The chamber's eyes followed her movement. She looked up at War Commander Zethkul, meeting his cold gaze without flinching. She thought about the messages she had received from Earth's government, the long debates in the Human Assembly, the votes of 47 colonial governors. The decision had not been close. She activated her translation device and spoke clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the massive chamber. Humanity had considered the Zarathi offer carefully, she said. They appreciated the Empire's restraint in allowing this discussion. They understood the consequences of their choice. The chamber held its breath. Lisa smiled, the expression cold and sharp. Humanity respectfully declined the Zarathi offer. They would not surrender their colonies. They would not reduce their military. They would not pay tribute to any empire. If the Zarathi wanted human worlds, they would have to take them by force. The silence that followed was deafening. For long moments, no one moved or spoke. Then the chamber exploded into chaos. Alien voices rose in disbelief and shock, translation devices overloaded trying to process hundreds of simultaneous conversations. Chairman Vexthol's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. War Commander Zethkul stared at Lisa as if she had grown a second head. The Altarian delegate actually fell from his perch, his delicate limbs trembling with shock. Through it all, Lisa stood calmly at the chamber's center. She had delivered humanity's message. Now it was time to leave. She gathered her documents and walked toward the exit, ignoring the chaos around her. Behind her, alien voices rose in panic and confusion. No species had ever rejected such terms when facing the Zarathi Empire. No one had chosen certain destruction over reasonable submission. The galaxy's carefully maintained order was cracking, and no one knew what would happen next. As the chamber doors closed behind her, Lisa allowed herself a small smile. The real message would come soon enough. Humanity had chosen war, and they intended to win it. 3 months had passed since Ambassador Lisa Martinez walked out of the Galactic Council chamber, and the galaxy was beginning to understand what humanity meant by choosing war. Reports flooded in from every corner of human space, each one more disturbing than the last. The peaceful trading posts and research stations that aliens had grown accustomed to visiting were transforming into something else entirely. Commander Jake Williams stood on the observation deck of Mars Station 7, watching the largest construction project in human history unfold before his eyes. Where once there had been mining facilities and research laboratories, massive shipyards now stretched across the Martian surface. The red planet hummed with activity, 24 hours a day as millions of workers raced to build humanity's war machine. The ships taking shape in those yards bore no resemblance to the elegant vessels favored by other galactic civilizations. Human warships were ugly, brutal things designed with only one purpose in mind. Their hulls were thick slabs of armor plating. Their weapon systems bulged from every surface like metallic tumors. Even their names reflected humanity's grim determination. Vengeance, retribution, blood price, final answer. Jake had served in the human fleet for 15 years, but he had never seen anything like this mobilization. Every available resource was being poured into ship construction. Entire asteroid fields were being stripped for raw materials. Civilian factories were retooled to produce weapons and ammunition. Even luxury cruise ships were being converted into troop transports and supply vessels. Captain Helen Brooks supervised the conversion operations on Titan, where Saturn's largest moon had become a fortress. The peaceful research station where she had once studied alien cultures was now a military command center surrounded by defensive platforms and missile batteries. Her former colleagues in the xenobiology department were now working on projects that would have horrified them just months earlier. Helen watched as another converted freighter left Titan's orbital shipyard. Its cargo holds filled with something the military called kinetic penetrators. She did not ask what they were for, but the engineers who built them wore expressions of grim satisfaction. Whatever these weapons were designed to do, they would do it very well. The transformation was not limited to military installations. On Europa, civilian miners were learning to use their equipment as weapons. Ice harvesting lasers could cut through ship hulls just as easily as frozen water. Construction mechs designed for building habitats could tear apart enemy troops with their massive claws. Even the massive fusion reactors that powered the colonies were being modified in ways that made the reactor technicians nervous. Dr. Eric Stone led a team of military engineers on Luna, where they worked in underground facilities that did not officially exist. The projects emerging from his laboratories violated several galactic conventions on warfare, but humanity had never signed those agreements. Nuclear mines that could destroy entire fleets, plasma weapons that could melt through any known armor, something called planet crackers that made even the most hardened military officers uncomfortable. Eric himself was disturbed by some of the things his team was creating, but he pushed those feelings aside. The Zarathi Empire had threatened to wipe out humanity completely. They had given no thought to human civilians or children when they issued their ultimatum. If they wanted to play by those rules, humanity would show them what those rules really meant. General Patricia Kane coordinated the overall strategy from Earth's military command center, buried deep beneath the Colorado mountains. Her plans baffled the few alien observers who managed to intercept fragments of human communications. Instead of concentrating forces for major battles, humanity was scattering its fleet across hundreds of systems. They were preparing for a kind of warfare that no galactic civilization had seen in millennia. Patricia understood what the aliens did not. The Zarathi Empire was vast and powerful, but that size could become a weakness. They were accustomed to fighting conventional battles against conventional enemies. They expected their opponents to mass their forces, fight for key systems, and surrender when defeat became inevitable. Humanity had no intention of doing any of those things. The human strategy was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Every human system would become a fortress. Every human ship would become a weapon. Every human citizen would become a soldier. The war would not be decided in a single massive battle, but in thousands of small encounters across the galaxy. The Zarathi could win every major engagement and still lose the war. On New Austin, farmers were learning to use agricultural chemicals to create improvised explosives. On New Berlin, factory workers practiced guerrilla warfare tactics during their lunch breaks. On New Tokyo, children as young as 10 were being taught how to operate anti-aircraft weapons. The aliens who witnessed these preparations called it barbaric, but humans called it necessary. The most disturbing reports came from the outer colonies, where human settlers were preparing for invasion with a determination that shocked alien observers. Entire cities were being converted into fortifications. Civilian transports were being armed with military-grade weapons. Even hospitals and schools were being equipped with defensive systems. Captain Roy Stevens commanded a strike force that was practicing deep space operations in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. His ships moved through the rocky debris field like predators stalking prey, using the asteroids for cover as they practiced hit-and-run attacks. The tactics they were developing had no names in any galactic military manual, because no civilized species had ever fought this way. The Zarathi Empire watched these preparations with growing unease. Their intelligence reports painted a picture of a species preparing for total war, not the limited conflict they had expected. Human behavior violated every assumption about civilized warfare. They were not just preparing to defend their territory, they were preparing to take the war to their enemies. War Commander Zethkul studied the reports from his flagship in Zarathi space, his cold eyes reflecting a growing concern. His previous conquest had followed predictable patterns. The target species would mass their forces for a few decisive battles, lose, and then negotiate surrender terms. The Zarathi would occupy the key systems and integrate the conquered worlds into their empire. Humanity showed no signs of following this pattern. They were preparing for a war of attrition that could last decades. They were arming their entire civilian population. They were building weapons that seemed designed to inflict maximum casualties, rather than achieve tactical objectives. Most disturbing of all, they showed no interest in preserving their own lives if it meant taking their enemies with them. The galaxy watched these preparations with mounting horror, but humanity continued its work with cold determination. Ambassador Lisa Martinez had delivered their message to the Galactic Council, and now they were preparing to make good on their promise. The Zarathi Empire wanted war, and humanity intended to give them more war than they could handle. The first shots of the war came at dawn on New Boston, a quiet farming colony on the edge of human space. Captain Ryan Mitchell was drinking his morning coffee when the alarms began screaming across the settlement. Through his kitchen window, he could see the dark shapes of Zarathi warships dropping out of hyperspace like falling stars. There were dozens of them, enough firepower to glass the entire planet if they chose to use it. Ryan had been expecting this moment for months, but seeing it happen still sent ice through his veins. New Boston was not a military target by any reasonable standard. It was home to 50,000 farmers, researchers, and their families. The colony's only defenses were a handful of patrol boats and some surface-to-air missiles left over from the early settlement days. Against the Zarathi Third Fleet, they might as well have been throwing rocks. The Zarathi fleet moved into orbit with mechanical precision, their gray ships forming a perfect blockade around the planet. War Commander Cal Thresh had chosen New Boston specifically because it was weak and isolated. He intended to make an example that would discourage other human colonies from resisting. A quick victory here would show the galaxy that humanity's threats were empty bluster. The bombardment began at noon local time. Zarathi plasma beams lanced down from orbit, targeting military installations and government buildings with surgical precision. The Colonial Defense Headquarters disappeared in a ball of green fire. The small spaceport melted under concentrated energy weapons. The communication arrays that connected New Boston to the rest of human space went silent one by one. Ryan gathered his small defense force at the emergency command bunker built into the mountains outside the main settlement. He had 8 patrol boats and maybe 200 volunteers with military training. The odds were so hopeless that several other species would have surrendered immediately. But Ryan had his orders from Earth. Fight until you cannot fight anymore. Then keep fighting anyway. The first engagement came when Zarathi dropships entered the atmosphere, carrying ground troops to secure key locations. Ryan's patrol boats rose to meet them, their small plasma cannons spitting fire at the much larger enemy vessels. The humans were outnumbered 10-1 and outgunned by an even wider margin, but they fought with a fury that caught the Zarathi completely off guard. Lieutenant Sarah Murphy piloted her patrol boat straight into a formation of Zarathi fighters, her weapons blazing even as enemy fire tore through her ship's hull. When her engines failed and her weapons went offline, she rammed her crippled vessel into a Zarathi dropship, taking both craft down in a spectacular explosion. The maneuver saved 300 civilians in the settlement below, but cost Sarah her life. The pattern repeated across the battlefield as human pilots refused to break off even when their ships were falling apart around them. When Sergeant Mike Foster's boat lost its weapon systems, he used his remaining engine power to ram a Zarathi bomber. When Lieutenant Amy Wilson's ship caught fire, she guided it into a cluster of enemy troops before ejecting at the last possible second. The Zarathi had never encountered such tactics. In their previous conquests, defeated enemy pilots would eject or surrender when their ships were disabled. Ramming attacks were considered suicide and therefore pointless. The idea that someone would deliberately sacrifice their life just to take a few enemies with them was incomprehensible to their military doctrine. On the ground, the situation became even stranger from the Zarathi perspective. When their troops landed in the main settlement, they found not just soldiers waiting for them but entire families armed with hunting rifles and farming equipment. Children as young as 12 operated improvised explosive devices, while their grandparents provided covering fire with ancient military weapons. Martha Johnson was 73 years old and had never fired a weapon in anger until the day the Zarathi landed in her backyard. She spent the morning teaching her 10-year-old grandson how to load ammunition belts for the heavy machine gun they had set up in their farmhouse. When Zarathi soldiers approached their position, Martha and little Bobby held them off for 3 hours before running out of ammunition. The most shocking moment for the Zarathi came when they captured a human field hospital. Instead of surrendering, The doctors and nurses continued treating wounded civilians even as enemy soldiers surrounded the building. Dr. Jennifer Adams refused to abandon her patients despite direct orders from Zarathi officers. She was still performing surgery when the building was destroyed by orbital bombardment. War Commander Cal Thresh watched the battle reports with growing frustration. His forces were winning every engagement, but the cost was horrific. Half his ground troops were dead or wounded. 3 of his capital ships had been damaged by ramming attacks. Worst of all, the human resistance was actually getting stronger as the battle continued, not weaker. The civilians were the biggest problem. Cal Thresh had conquered 17 different species, and civilian populations always remained passive during military operations. They might hide or flee, but they did not fight. The humans of New Boston were different. Every farmer was a potential sniper. Every child could be carrying explosives. Every building might contain an ambush. By evening, Cal Thresh controlled the planet's major cities and installations, but the human population continued fighting from the countryside. When his troops tried to establish supply depots, they came under attack from families armed with agricultural chemicals turned into bombs. When they set up communication posts, teenagers would sneak up at night and sabotage the equipment. The final horror came when a group of human colonists barricaded themselves in a school with their children. Rather than surrender when Zarathi troops surrounded the building, they chose to detonate their remaining explosives, killing themselves and taking 50 enemy soldiers with them. The explosion could be seen from orbit, a final act of defiance that left even hardened Zarathi veterans shaken. When the battle ended after 3 days of fighting, War Commander Cal Thresh technically controlled New Boston. The human military forces were destroyed. The government buildings were rubble. The communication systems were offline. By every standard measure, the Zarathi Third Fleet had won a complete victory, but the cost made the victory feel like a defeat. Cal Thresh had lost 30% of his fleet and over half his ground forces. The human colony he had expected to conquer in a matter of hours had held out for 3 days and inflicted casualties that should have been impossible. Most disturbing of all, the human population had chosen death over submission, something no other species had ever done. The news of New Boston spread across the galaxy within hours, carried by merchant ships and diplomatic couriers to every corner of civilized space. The report seemed impossible to believe. A minor human colony had fought the mighty Zarathi Third Fleet to a standstill and made them pay in blood for every meter of ground. The implications terrified every species that had ever faced the Zarathi threat. In the Galactic Council chamber, emergency sessions convened as representatives tried to understand what had happened. The human tactics violated every assumption about rational behavior. No sane species would choose extinction over reasonable surrender terms, yet that appeared to be exactly what humanity was doing. The nightmare began 6 months after New Boston fell, and it started in ways the Zarathi Empire never expected. Colonel Ben Taylor materialized his strike force in the Kethavar system at exactly midnight, ship time. His 12 vessels appeared from hyperspace like ghosts, their black hulls absorbing sensor sweeps and making them nearly invisible against the cosmic background. The Zarathi military base orbiting Kethavar Prime had no warning before human plasma cannons began tearing through their defensive platforms. The attack lasted exactly 43 minutes. Taylor's ships moved through the system like a pack of predators, destroying everything of military value they could find. Supply depots exploded in chains of fire. Communication arrays collapsed under concentrated weapons fire. 3 Zarathi cruisers that tried to respond were cut apart by focused beam attacks before they could bring their main guns to bear. When it was over, the humans simply vanished back into hyperspace, leaving behind a scene of devastation that shocked the Zarathi garrison. They had lost 2/3 of their defensive capability and had not managed to destroy even one human ship. Worse yet, they had no idea where the attackers had come from or where they had gone. The pattern repeated across Zarathi space over the following weeks. Human raiders would appear without warning, strike hard at military targets, then disappear before reinforcements could arrive. Unlike conventional warfare where armies fought for territory, the humans seemed interested only in destruction. They took nothing, held nothing, but left behind a trail of burning installations and shattered fleets. Lieutenant Commander Amy Rodriguez commanded the stealth ship Silent Running, one of dozens of human vessels that had infiltrated deep into enemy territory. Her ship was a masterpiece of human engineering, designed specifically for long-range reconnaissance and sabotage operations. Its hull was coated with materials that absorbed sensor beams, and its engines were tuned to produce minimal energy signatures. Amy's mission was different from the strike teams. Where they hit military targets, she focused on the infrastructure that kept the Zarathi Empire functioning. Supply convoys disappeared along trade routes that had been safe for centuries. Communication relays went offline without explanation. Even civilian shipping began to avoid certain sectors after too many vessels simply vanished without sending distress signals. The psychological effect on the Zarathi was devastating. Their empire had been built on the assumption that their military strength was absolute and their territory was secure. Now their own supply lines had become hunting grounds for human predators. Merchant captains refused to travel without military escort, but even escort fleets sometimes disappeared entirely. The most terrifying human tactic emerged on the conquered world of Velthar, where Major Chris Johnson's unit had been inserted 3 months after the Zarathi occupation began. The aliens had expected the usual pattern: military defeat followed by civilian compliance and eventual integration into the Empire. Instead, they found themselves facing something they had never encountered before. Chris and his 200 soldiers did not try to retake the planet through conventional assault. Instead, they melted into the civilian population and began teaching guerrilla warfare to anyone willing to learn. The peaceful Velthari, who had surrendered without resistance, suddenly became an armed insurgency that made the planet ungovernable. Every Zarathi patrol faced potential ambush. Every supply convoy needed heavy escort. Every government building required fortress-level security. The Zarathi found themselves needing to maintain an occupation force of 50,000 troops, just to control a single agricultural world. Troops that could have been fighting humans elsewhere. The insurgency spread like a plague. On Mordun, factory workers sabotaged production lines that made Zarathi military equipment. On Kelthara, farmers poisoned food supplies destined for enemy forces. On Tethaval, even children participated in the resistance, carrying messages and planting explosives with the innocent faces that let them pass through security checkpoints. Unnoticed, Dr. Rachel Murphy had once been a respected xenobiologist, studying alien life forms for peaceful purposes. Now she worked in a laboratory buried deep beneath the surface of Ceres, developing weapons that made her former colleagues sick with horror. Her specialty was biological warfare, tailored specifically to Zarathi physiology. Rachel's creations were elegant in their lethality: viruses that attacked Zarathi immune systems, bacteria that consumed the proteins their bodies needed to survive, chemical agents that disrupted their nervous systems while leaving other species completely unharmed. When Zarathi commanders protested these weapons as violations of galactic law, the human response was always the same: humanity had never signed those treaties. The first biological attack came on the Zarathi military world of Zektul, where a garrison of 200,000 troops was preparing for the next phase of expansion into human space. The base's water supply was contaminated with one of Rachel's creations, a modified virus that appeared harmless for the first week after infection. By the time symptoms appeared, it was too late to contain the outbreak. Within a month, the entire garrison was dead or dying. The few survivors who tried to evacuate carried the infection to other Zarathi worlds, spreading the plague through their military ranks like wildfire. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Fleet operations ground to a halt as crews fell ill. Even the civilians in nearby systems began to panic as reports of the plague reached them. The Zarathi had biological weapons of their own, but human settlements seemed strangely resistant to every pathogen they deployed. It took them months to realize that humanity had been secretly vaccinating their population against Zarathi bioweapons since the war began. The humans had been planning for biological warfare from the very beginning. Captain Elena Santos commanded a human battle group that specialized in turning Zarathi victories into Pyrrhic disasters. When enemy forces conquered the mining world of New Olympia, they found the facilities had been sabotaged so thoroughly that rebuilding would take decades. When they captured the research station at Alpha Centauri B, they discovered that all the data had been corrupted and the equipment booby-trapped. The humans seemed determined to leave nothing useful behind for their enemies. Planets were stripped of resources before evacuation. Space stations were reduced to scrap metal. Even civilian infrastructure was destroyed, rather than allowed to fall into Zarathi hands. The Empire found itself conquering empty shells instead of functioning worlds. The most disturbing reports came from Zerathi intelligence services, who had discovered human sleeper agents embedded throughout their territory. These agents had been living normal lives for years, some for decades, waiting for activation orders that came when the war began. Scientists became saboteurs. Merchants became spies. Even some Zerathi allies were revealed to be human operatives working under deep cover. The galaxy watched these developments with mounting terror. The Galactic Council convened emergency session after emergency session, but no one knew how to respond to humanity's tactics. Every species had their own conflicts and territorial disputes, and the human example was beginning to inspire imitators. Oppressed populations across the galaxy were starting to ask why they had to accept subjugation when the humans had shown that resistance was possible. War Commander Cal Thresh, now bearing scars from multiple encounters with human forces, filed report after report with his superiors. The war was not going according to any plan or precedent. Human forces seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. They struck without warning and vanished without trace. They showed no interest in holding territory or protecting their own lives. Most importantly, they were winning. Not through decisive battles or grand strategies, but through the slow, relentless attrition of Zerathi strength. Every day brought new reports of losses, setbacks, and disasters. The mighty empire that had seemed invincible just months before was bleeding from thousands of cuts, and the humans showed no signs of stopping their assault. 2 years had passed since the war began, and the impossible was happening in the Galactic Council chamber. War Commander Cal Thresh stood where human Ambassador Lisa Martinez had once stood, but his proud bearing was gone. The Zerathi officer who had once demanded humanity's surrender now bore the scars of a dozen battles, and his gray skin had taken on the pale color of defeat. President Diana Brooks sat in the human delegation section, her calm expression hiding the satisfaction she felt at this moment. She had been elected specifically to see this war through to its conclusion, and the people of Earth had given her absolute authority to negotiate humanity's terms. The chamber around her buzzed with nervous energy as alien representatives tried to understand how the galaxy's balance of power had shifted so completely. Chairman Vexthal's forearms trembled slightly as he called the emergency session to order. The insectoid being had presided over hundreds of territorial disputes, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this situation. The Zerathi Empire, masters of over 100 worlds, had formally requested mediation to end their war with humanity. It was unprecedented in galactic history. Cal Thresh began his presentation with the mechanical precision that had once made the Zerathi military so feared, but his voice carried undertones of exhaustion that every species in the chamber could hear. He listed the losses his empire had suffered: 347 major military installations destroyed, 68 worlds in active rebellion, 37% of their fleet either destroyed or too damaged to fight. The statistics were staggering, but the human cost was equally shocking. Humanity had lost only 12 worlds to Zerathi occupation, but they had made the Empire pay for every single conquest. The agricultural world of New Sydney had cost the Zerathi an entire battle fleet. The mining colony on Kepler 442b had taken 8 months to subdue and required a garrison of 100,000 troops to maintain control. President Brooks listened to the casualty reports without changing expression. She had authorized every operation that Cal Thresh described, from the biological weapons that devastated Zerathi military bases to the insurgency campaigns that made occupation impossible. Each number represented human lives lost but also enemy strength eliminated. The arithmetic of war was brutal. But humanity had proven they could do the math better than anyone expected. The most damaging revelation came when Cal Thresh admitted that 17 Zerathi worlds had declared independence and joined the human alliance. These were not conquered territories but core empire planets where the civilian population had risen up against their own government. The example of human resistance had inspired revolution throughout Zerathi space, turning the empire's strength into weakness. Captain Roy Stevens commanded the human fleet that waited just outside the Zerathi home system, close enough that their sensor signatures could be detected by anyone looking. His ships carried the weapons that Dr. Eric Stone's team had developed in secret, the planet crackers that could reduce entire worlds to asteroid fields. The mere existence of these weapons had forced the Zerathi to the negotiating table. Roy had specific orders from President Brooks. If negotiations failed, if the Zarathi tried to continue the war, he was to use those weapons without hesitation. Humanity had moved beyond caring about galactic opinion or moral judgments. They had been threatened with extinction, and they were prepared to respond in kind. The Zarathi terms were pathetic compared to the ultimatum they had delivered 2 years earlier. They offered mutual non-aggression treaties, limited reparations and recognition of human territorial claims. They promised to withdraw from occupied human worlds and respect humanity's right to expansion. It was everything they had refused to consider when they thought they held all the advantages. President Brooks stood slowly, her movement commanding immediate attention from every being in the vast chamber. The aliens who had once dismissed humanity as primitive newcomers now watched her with expressions ranging from fear to fascination. She had become the most powerful person in the galaxy simply by refusing to accept defeat. Her response was delivered in the same calm tone that Lisa Martinez had used 2 years earlier, but the words carried the weight of absolute victory. Humanity rejected the Zarathi terms completely. The Empire had threatened human extinction, and now they would face the consequences of that choice. There would be no negotiated peace, no mutual agreements, no return to the previous status quo. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs as President Brooks outlined humanity's demands. The Zarathi Empire would surrender unconditionally within 30 days. Their military forces would be disbanded and their weapons turned over to human control. War Commander Cal Thresh and every other officer involved in planning the war against humanity would be tried for crimes against sapient life. Most shocking of all, the Zarathi government would be dissolved entirely. Their worlds would be placed under Galactic Council administration until new governments could be established. The empire that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries would simply cease to exist, broken apart by a species they had thought too weak to matter. Cal Thresh stared at President Brooks as if she had spoken in an alien language. The terms were not negotiation but dictation, not compromise but conquest. No major power had ever been forced to accept such complete defeat, especially not by a smaller adversary. The very concept violated everything the Zarathi understood about how warfare was supposed to work. Chairman Vex Thule tried to restore order as alien delegates shouted questions and protests. Several species demanded that humanity moderate their terms, that they show mercy to a defeated enemy. The crystalline zealots calculated the economic disruption that would result from the Empire's dissolution. The meditative collective spoke of forgiveness and the need to end cycles of violence. President Brooks listened to their objections with the patience of someone who held all the advantages. When the chamber finally quieted, she explained humanity's position with terrifying clarity. The Zarathi had chosen to make this a war of extinction, and humanity had simply proven better at that game than their enemies expected. The 30-day deadline was not negotiable. Captain Stevens's fleet would remain in position, ready to implement the final solution if the Zarathi failed to comply. Humanity had developed weapons specifically designed to crack planets apart, and they would use them without hesitation if forced to do so. The choice belonged entirely to the Zarathi Empire. The silence that followed was different from the one that had greeted Lisa Martinez's rejection 2 years earlier. That had been shocked disbelief at humanity's audacity. This was the quiet of species recognizing that the galaxy had a new apex predator, one that had proven its willingness to destroy anything that threatened its survival. Cal Thresh looked around the chamber for support that was not coming. The same alien civilizations that had encouraged Zarathi aggression 2 years earlier now avoided his gaze. No one wanted to be associated with the losing side, especially when the winners had demonstrated such ruthless efficiency. The war commander's surrender came not with grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but with a simple nod of acceptance. The Zarathi Empire would comply with human demands rather than face complete annihilation. The decision was purely practical. Death was final, but defeat could be survived. As the session ended and delegates began filing out of the chamber, President Brooks allowed herself a small smile. It was the same expression that had terrified alien commanders across the galaxy, cold and sharp and utterly without mercy. Humanity had taken its place at the top of the galactic food chain, and everyone now understood what that meant. The age of diplomatic solutions and negotiated compromises was over. The age of humanity had begun, and it would be written in the ashes of anyone foolish enough to challenge it.